ISI General Mahmoud. He was in Washington last week at the time of the terrorist attacks, and according to the Pakistani foreign minister, he will be conveying to the leadership of the Taliban some of what he learned in Washington after the attack. Information that provides at least preliminary links between this attack and Osama bin Laden. He will be urging the Taliban leadership to turn bin Laden over in order to avoid what the Pakistani officials are describing as very, very grave consequences. He's expected back here in Islamabad at the end of the day Monday. Pakistani foreign minister made clear that the expectations that this mission will prove successful are fairly modest, although Pakistan's military intelligence has long-standing links with the Taliban. Pakistani officials say that the Afghan leadership very much goes its own way on these matters. Meanwhile, the word is that at some point in the next few days, a group from the United States, an interagency delegation comprising officials from the State Department, the CIA, and the military, are likely to come here to Pakistan to begin further consultations on how Pakistan can cooperate with the United States.
The discussions that we have held with the government of the United States deal with principles in general. Pakistan will extend full cooperation in the fight against terrorism. As for the specifics, we expect consultations, and we understand from the news that a group of high-level officials from the United States will be visiting Pakistan in the near future. We would like also to know the plan that the United States has in mind, and then we will discuss what and to what extent Pakistan can be a partner in the fight against terrorism.
Among the options that have been raised are those including the U.S. Aircraft flying over Pakistan on missions in Afghanistan, intelligence sharing. This could be particularly crucial because, as we've been noting, Pakistan's military intelligence does have long-standing ties with the Taliban and probably knows more about them than any outside group. There's also a possibility, of course, that American troops could be based here, pre-positioned here to move into Afghanistan. That raises, however, some particularly sensitive political questions for this government. There have already been critical voices raised, especially among the Islamic fundamentalist groups here, warning the government of President Musharraf not to give that kind of support to the United States for any action against a neighboring Muslim nation. So it's a very, very sensitive issue, but authorities here are saying that Pakistan is prepared to do whatever is necessary to help the U.S. Colleen?
Well, and how serious is that, Mike? Because we've heard Pakistani officials as soon as just a couple of hours ago seeming to be saying, look, the rest of the world has got to realize we've got our own domestic situation here. You may need to temper your expectations because of that. I mean, to what extent could cooperation with the United States perhaps destabilize the government?
Government officials here are saying that the authorities are prepared to deal with any upsurge in protest. There is no question that the Islamic parties and the opposition do have the ability to put a lot of people on the streets and to create a lot of trouble. In addition, many of the religious schools run by Pakistani Islamic fundamentalists have trained fighters who've gone on and fought with the Taliban in Afghanistan's own civil wars, so there's always a danger that some of those people could become active here in Pakistan. Nonetheless, it's very clear that the government and the ruling elite are by and large united in their desire to side with the United States. In the past, the Islamic fundamentalists have posed a consistent pressure group on General Musharraf, and it may be that if this plays out in a good way for him, that he will end up both consolidating his position and neutralizing the threat that they now pose. Nonetheless, there is every possibility of some trouble on the streets, although how much will depend to some degree also on how effectively the president makes the case. And we are told that either later today or on Tuesday he will address the people of Pakistan and lay out his reasons for siding with Washington.
All right, CNN's Mike Shenoy in Islamabad. Thanks.
Well, more now on the wider international reaction to Tuesday's attacks. I'm joined from London by James Geary of Time magazine. Mr. Geary, thanks so much for being with us. How do you see international reaction thus far in terms of what the US is planning to do?
Well, certainly in Europe, there's enormous support for the United States in the wake of the attacks. At the same time, there's also great concern that whatever military action, military reprisals are taken in response to the attacks are well targeted and don't lead to a worsening of the situation or a spread of the situation to other parts of the world.
Is there a fear that that may occur, that the US might be a bit trigger happy perhaps, that there's a desire to strike back and strike back now?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that some European leaders, such as Tony Blair in the UK and the French president, have been asking the United States to provide evidence of the links between the perpetrators, the actual hard facts that they've discovered that would justify the attacks. And I think this would go some way to allaying perhaps some public fears that the U.S. is lashing out without proper due process or in an act of revenge rather than an act of justice. And I think that could further inflame public opinion throughout the world.
How much juggling needs to be done? How delicately handled does this need to be? I mean, we've been talking in the last hour or two specifically about Pakistan. I mean, there is a country that has to answer to its own religious zealots, supporters of the Taliban, not to mention Islamic countries on which it relies itself. The ingredients are potentially there to create enormous civil unrest. How difficult is it going to be for the US to fight this war without upsetting someone somewhere?
Well, I think it will be impossible. I think people will be upset in many places. And I think that's also part of the diplomatic concern here in Europe. There's more of an emphasis on a diplomatic offensive, if you will, to go along with a military response. And you can envision something such as a Marshall Plan for the Muslim world, for example. I think European leaders feel that it's important for the U.S. to show that this is not a clash of civilizations. In fact, that's just the way the terrorists present this conflict, that it is a battle between civilization and barbarism. And I think some kind of diplomatic, economic, political gesture towards Muslim people and Muslim governments in the world would be most welcome. And that would allay some of the fears about a military response, I think.
And the fact that striking hard may just sort of provoke the anti-American fanaticism that it's designed to eradicate. How do you see the future of the word alliance? You know, alliances when we think of NATO and we think of other pacts around the world. If we're going to be looking at alliances between the United States and Islamic countries, it really changes the very nature of the word alliance, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and I think that could be one of the positive things that results from this horrific situation. If, for example, in the Gulf War, if a similar alliance to that one could be created and sustained, and I think that's the crucial point, that when military action does take place, and it certainly will take place, and I'm convinced it will be massive military action, that along with the economic and diplomatic and political efforts that I mentioned earlier, if these things can be held together and sustained for the period of time it will take to deal with this problem, that could be certainly months, perhaps years, I think that could lead to more stability throughout the world,
James,
including the
very briefly before I let you go, I've got to ask you, you were just talking about the importance of softly, softly, if you like, and then you said you're expecting a massive response. How do you see those two views tying in?
Well, I think a massive military response is required, given the nature of the attack on the United States. I don't think the U.S. government or the American people would settle for anything less. But as I said, that won't solve the problem of world terrorism. That just, in many ways, could exacerbate the problem and lead to the recruits of more like-minded people, especially if civilians are involved. So I think a two- or three-pronged effort is necessary. The military aspect is certainly probably the first thing that will happen, to be combined with perhaps economic aid and a major diplomatic push to address some of the underlying issues that feed this kind of fanaticism. So I see these things working together.
Okay, James Geary of Time magazine in London. Thanks. Colin.
All right, Michael, stock markets in Europe have opened for business with about 30 minutes of trading under their belt right now. Let's go to Richard Queston, our London bureau, for a first look at the numbers. Richard, how's it looking?
Hello, Colleen. It's a very big day indeed. Of course, Wall Street will start trading in about 6-7 hours' time, first time for 4 days and following the attack. And the European markets have just opened. I remind you that there were some very sharp falls in Europe on Friday. This is how things are looking at the moment. London's FTSE, well, you can see just as small gains and losses, really, across the board. 2 up and 2 down. London and Frankfurt both are up, small gains, and Paris and Zurich down. Zurich is off quite sharply, down around 96 points, over 1%. And that's largely because of what's happening in the airline stocks. Airline, of course, shares are of key concern to investors this Monday, with several large US carriers announcing over the weekend that they'll cut back their schedules by 20% and lay off workers, in some cases tens of thousands of workers. Liz George is at the London Stock Exchange to give us an early look on how Euro airline stocks are faring. Liz?
Richard, thanks very much indeed. I'll take you across and show you the share prices immediately on those major airlines in Europe, and you can see that all of them are being sold off very sharply first thing this morning. You've got British Airways down another 2.42%, bearing in mind that British Airways actually lost about 36% of its share price over the last week, and on Friday it lost 15.8%, so we really are seeing a sell-off going on these airlines. You mentioned the Zurich Bourse being fairly sharply being sold off, and Swiss Air as well, you can see, is one of the reasons for that. It's down 10.26% this morning, a big sell-off going on there. Lufthansa, Air France, right across the airline sector, we're seeing all of those stocks really being sold off, and that's despite the fact that a lot of these airlines are beginning to get their services back to normal. Again, we had British Airways saying that it was flying about 70% of its normal services from Heathrow and 80% from Gatwick to the States, and Lufthansa is flying 25 of its 26 flights to the States. So although the fact that these airlines are actually getting their services back and flying as normal, we're still seeing their share prices falling, their shares being sold off in the markets. That's really on the back of the fact that the industry is going to bear a big cost for the fact that services were shut down over the last few days. In the US, the industry is facing a bill of something like $1 billion. So really, that's going to hit these share prices fairly hard. And the volume is also going to be slackening off. And they're saying that really volume's going to be slackening between 30 to 50%, really looking ahead as well. So it's not a good picture for the airlines, and they're all being sold off today. Richard.
Liz George, many thanks indeed. Perhaps an indication of the instability now that we are starting to see and the worrying global situation. Gold has just opened in London. It's up $4 an ounce at $290 an ounce. Gold, of course, often seen as the last refuge in times of crisis. And stocks in the defence industry actually appear to be bucking a trend. Hardly surprising, of course, because when things get grim, people move into defence stocks.
In the case of defence stocks, in a time like this, they will do. We look like we're going to have a protracted period of war zone thought process. And therefore, in the United States, Lockheed Martin, who make jets and things like that, they are going to do extremely well. And over here, we've got British Aerospace, and in France, EDS. And that's the sort of stock that I think people will be looking to make some money out of during the course of the weeks to come.
That is a traditional move, of course. Defence stocks always seem to gain when there are times of global instability. To the dollar now, and a quick look at how the currency markets are trading. Traditionally, one would have seen a flight to the dollar at times of unease, but not at the moment. These are the way the rates are trading at the moment. The euro, a strong gain, and now trading at 92 US cents. The Japanese yen has put on a cent in the past 24 hours, and sterling too is up at 147.69. Of course, in 6 hours, the New York Stock Exchange reopens after the longest closure since the Great Depression. And those who live in the financial district are beginning to return to their homes. But as Brian Cabell reports, some residents are finding there's little to go home to.
There is hustle and bustle on Wall Street, but it's not the usual kind. Police cars control the streets, along along with the Humvees. Pedestrians, it seems, are blocked at every other intersection. Wall Street and the surrounding neighborhood resembles an armed camp, a dusty armed camp.